Good evening. My name is Gail Fisher, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to the fourth annual partnership between the Detroit Jewish Book Fair and the Detroit Institute of Arts. As a past chairperson of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair and a current docent at the DIA, I could attest to the importance of finding the perfect book that highlights the DIA's collection for this event. Blake Gopnik joins our esteemed previous speakers of this program, Simon Goodman, Father Patrick Desbois, and Mary Gabriel, who all authored books whose content is related to art that is featured at the DIA. Blake Gopnik's book, Warhol, successfully brings together these two prestigious institutions and provides the opportunity for patrons of each organization to become aware of each other's establishment and mission. The goal of the Detroit Jewish Book Fair is to bring the best new Jewish books and authors from around the world to Metro Detroit. This mission continues today, even in these unprecedented times. The Jewish Book Fair runs through December 9th, with many exceptional speakers still forthcoming. So please visit our website at culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair, where you could see our entire schedule of events, learn about ways to support the book fair, watch events you might have missed, and peruse our online store. This year, in order to provide our extensive lineup to the community, we have made all our events free of charge. This could only occur through the generosity of patrons and sponsors. So if you enjoyed this speaker and others, please consider donating. Also, the Detroit Jewish Book Fair extends our thanks to the Detroit Institute of Arts for their generous, continuous support of this program. Blake Gopnik's monumental book, Warhol, meticulously examines the life and art of one of the most extraordinary artists of the late 20th century. Blake takes us through a deep dive of Warhol's colorful life, immersing all of us in rich detail. With his unique access to the archives in the Andy Warhol Museum in Pittsburgh, Blake brings to life the enigma which is Andy Warhol, whose art continues to affect our culture today. Blake Gopnik is one of the leading art writers in North America. He was the fine arts editor and art critic at the Globe and Mail, Canada's national newspaper, the chief art critic at the Washington Post and Newsweek, a critic at large for ArtNet News, and a regular contributor to the New York Times. He began work on his Warhol book in 2013. Blake received a bachelor's degree from McGill University in Medieval Studies and a PhD in art history from Oxford University. Blake will be in conversation with our moderator, Clare Rogan, the curator of prints and drawings at the Detroit Institute of Arts. Her specialties include German art from 1848 to 1945, European and American prints and drawings, and LGBTQ art. At the DIA, she recently curated the exhibition From Camelot to Kent State, Pop Art, 1960 to 1975. Clare received a bachelor's degree in art and archaeology from Princeton University and earned an MA and PhD in history of art from Brown University. Also, this Thursday, December 10th at 1 o'clock, please join the weekly DIA program, Thursdays at the Museum, found on dia.org website under Senior Programs, for a docent-led tour of Warhol and our pop art collection. We want you to be part of this exciting event, and our presenters will answer your questions at the end of their discussion. So please put your comments and questions in the YouTube comment section below, or you could text them to the number in the corner of your screen. Please join me in virtually welcoming our speakers, Clare Rogan and Blake Gopnik.
Hello, thank you, Gail.
Thank you.
Pleasure. And I just want to say that Clare Rogan, my dear interlocutrix here, is dealing in the best way possible with technological problems. She's unstoppable. So we're going to proceed. Some router problems, I think, got things started, got a rocky start, but now we're moving ahead, and I'm so pleased that Claire is here with me, or was here with me. Ah, there she is. Sorry about this. Hi, Claire.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
My router just gave up the ghost, so we are doing it a little more informally than planned. We had it so perfectly planned. So Blake, I have a couple questions for you, and I also want to mention that the docents at the Detroit Institute of Arts, many of them have already read your book. They have scoured it front to back and sent us lots of great questions that we'll be able to address. There it is.
There it is.
So
It takes a lot to scour this.
Lots going on there. And before we get into that, though, I'd like to ask you a few general questions about your process, about what it was like living with Warhol for 7 years. Well, maybe we'll just start with that. You have a career as an art critic, as a writer more generally, as an art historian. So what was it like switching to biography? What was it like switching and choosing somebody like Warhol?
It was insane. It was completely wild. Changed everything I did. But Warhol was a gift that just kept on giving, I have to say. I spent 7 years on it, immersed more thoroughly in his life than I've ever been in my own, I think. And it was just sheer joy. He's a fascinating character. I never got tired of him over all that time. I've read hundreds of thousands of documents about him, you know, from ticket stubs to shows he went to, taxi receipts to, you know, substantial scholarly tomes. And all of it was great and fascinating. It was stressful. It was intense. You know, I was working, especially towards the end, 7 days a week, 6 a.m. to midnight every single day, because there's just too much Warhol. That turns out to be the problem with Warhol. I've never seen anything like it. When I was a medieval scholar, it was much easier because there were just a few documents on any one or anything you wanted to talk about. Warhol, it's really a tsunami of information. And that was the most interesting and confusing thing about writing about Warhol.
Well, that's wonderful. And let me just see here. So that's in terms of living with Warhol and writing at that intensity, because he was a collector himself as well. He documented himself with such excess, with such as if the documenting is also an artwork as well.
Absolutely, except I came to the conclusion after a few years of suffering with his documentation that it wasn't, as with so many famous figures, the goal wasn't to actually reveal himself, but quite the opposite. He realized that if you over-document yourself, especially if you don't sort your papers in any way, you're actually doing the opposite. You're actually hiding yourself. And I think that's the most interesting thing about Warhol, is the way that he hides himself in a kind of surfeit of information. And that somehow is true of his art as well. There's so much in his art, seemingly on the surface of his art, but there always seems to be something hidden behind it as well. You never come to the end of his art. What looks to be a simple message, a simple declaration, declarative statement, turns out to be much more complicated. So there's this wonderful tension in Warhol's life and in his art between information and obfuscation. And that's one of the things that made this so exciting, and I hope makes the book interesting, because I tried not to clean things up too much. I hoped, as I was writing it, to keep things in play, to keep as many balls in the air as possible, to reveal that for every single narrative, every single moment in his life, there are several narratives. There's different versions of almost every story that is told about him and about what he did. And that, of course, is why the book is 1,000 pages long versus what it should have been, I guess, of 650 or 750. I guess I'll defend myself by saying that most books about famous artists go volume after volume. And I managed to do it all in one very fat volume. And it could be worse. The German edition that just came out is 1,200 pages and required 6 translators to get it down into German. So you've got a kind of discount version in English, a fast read. in English. But it was, he is one of these figures. I don't think it's quite recognized with the general public, the extent to which he has the kind of depth that he does. It's so easy to see the Campbell soup cans as very straightforward. It's easy to see everything about him as very straightforward. In the 70s and 80s, he did these, the famous celebrity portraits, and they just seem to be straightforward images of celebrities. They seem to have nothing behind them. And of course, he said that about himself. He said, I'm all on the surface. There's nothing behind. But that was a false superficiality, I think. I think anyone who actually spends the time digging into Warhol, trying to go deeper, finds that there's lots and lots of depth there. And that's certainly true among professional art historians. There's probably at least as much written about him as about any other figure in 20th century art. And the greatest art historians of our time keep going deeper and deeper into him and finding more and more to think about. His interaction with American culture is so fascinating. He's more closely tied in to society than other figures are. Many other artists just seem to be making their art within society, but he's making art that's, in a sense, about society. He's so deeply connected to the world that he was in. I'm just wondering if we have Claire back, or shall I monologue some more? I wonder, Eric, maybe we should put up the PowerPoint if you have it. I'm not sure that we have the PowerPoint either. Let me talk for a minute about Warhol in Detroit. We had an image of him. He visited Detroit in 1985. And there's a wonderful photograph, which we may be able to show you in a minute, of him high above Detroit in a hotel restaurant from 1985. He visited the city, and I imagine that when he visited Detroit, he actually recognized it as a city that he was familiar with, because he came from Pittsburgh, which both in the 30s and 40s, when Warhol was young, both Detroit and Pittsburgh were, of course, boom towns at that moment, both industrial boom towns with wonderful institutions. Pittsburgh had the Carnegie Institute. There we've got an image. There's the image that I was hoping for. And Detroit had the Detroit Institute of Arts. They were both rising cities. They were both optimistic cities, full of, among other things, immigrants. Warhol was from the Ruthenian or Carpatho-Rusyn immigrant community in Pittsburgh, a tiny little community that's from sort of the depths of the Carpathian Mountains. And I think that made him comfortable with the communities that there would have been in Detroit as well. He would have understood what it was to come from working class roots. He would have understood the social matrix of Detroit when he got there. And it's worth mentioning, since I'm speaking to JCC, that he was actually closely in touch as a young man. His family was in touch with the Jewish community in Pittsburgh. They had Jewish lodgers upstairs. Things were very hard during the Great Depression. They took in Jewish lodgers. He and his brothers actually worked for various Jewish businesses in the neighborhood. Their neighborhood, where they were as Carpatho-Rusyns, that also included Irish people and Italians, was very near one of the Jewish neighborhoods in Pittsburgh. And it's said that Warhol's brothers worked for the Jewish merchants Friday nights and Saturdays when they couldn't work themselves. They kept the stores open. And it looks as though Warhol actually worked in a dairy restaurant as a soda jerk during the summers when he was in high school, probably. So there are interesting connections between Warhol. I could actually write a long article, and maybe I should, about Warhol and Judaism. It's a very complicated set of relationships. But I think Warhol's outsider status, which is very important. He was an outsider as a Carpatho-Rusyn, as what's called a Byzantine Catholic, something very unusual. As a gay man, he had all of these outsider cultural matrices that he moved through. Actually gave him, I think, a lot in common with some American Jews and some of the contribution that Jews made to American culture. So I think there's something interesting there to explore. And there were Jews in his later life as well as a fine artist. Some of his most important contacts in the art world were Jewish, in fact. Some of the dealers and curators that helped him rise were Jewish as well. So I think that's very interesting. So it's this combination of being an outsider by virtue of your ethnicity and also being an outsider by virtue of your class. After all, being working class wasn't the norm in high culture in America in the 1960s when he really arrived as a fine artist.
I think that is also interesting. I just want to say hello to everyone. My name is Jamie Loeb. I'm the Senior Director of Cultural Arts here at the JCC. I'm going to fill in for Claire for a moment while hopefully she fixes her internet problems, because she is obviously the expert here, but I will help move the questions along from the audience. And, you know, you mentioned, it was very interesting earlier, you said that he documented his life in order to obfuscate it. And we have some comments from the audience saying how much of an enigma he was. After reading the book, they still don't feel like they know who he was. So was that part of your goal when in presenting the book the way you did? And do you think there is a Warhol to know, or is he just unknowable?
I think we're all unknowable. The bottom line is that the fiction of biography is that you can reveal the soul of the artist. Well, I don't buy that fiction. I don't buy it for portraiture, and I don't buy it really for biography either. There have been people complaining that I didn't reveal Warhol's soul. But I don't know what a soul is, and B, I don't know if you can ever reveal it. If someone were to say they've revealed Blake Gopnik's soul, I wouldn't know what that meant, and I don't suppose they could. So there's a kind of philosophical basis to that, but he is also phenomenally complex. I hope that if I haven't revealed his soul, I've given lots and lots of glimpses of the various, if you like, souls that lived within his body. Because one of the things that's important is he changed so much over time. More, I think, than most people, more than most artists. He changed his art, he changed his persona in the most profound ways as the culture changed around him. I mean, his relationship to his own homosexuality had to change from 1930s and 40s Pittsburgh, where it would have been a nightmare to be openly gay, and he was fairly openly gay, to the 80s, the 70s and 80s at Studio 54, where being gay, you could almost say, became fashionable in New York. So there's lots and lots happening around him, and more than most artists, more, for instance, than Picasso, who he's sometimes compared to. He really changed with the times and became part of the times and wanted to be very much part of the world that was around him.
So why do you think he in particular was so malleable and so, well, changing with the times, as you say? I mean, he seemed to be very good at capturing that, like, that momentness. So what made him so good at that kind of changing where it's harder for other artists?
You know, I think it's because he was simply an incredibly good artist in a kind of old-fashioned way. Old-fashioned, I should say, modernist way. He's very much kind of the quintessential 20th century artist. A lot of people talk about him as a great postmodernist, in a sense, as an artist of the 21st century. But I think he's got a kind of old-fashioned ethos of wanting to make it new at every moment. And the only way to make it new, or one of the ways to make it new, is to be part of your time, to change constantly. He hated being bored or being boring. And that's probably, I think, the key to understanding him as an artist, is that he couldn't stand repeating himself. Or more importantly, because he did repeat himself, he wanted to make repetition part of his art form. He wanted the kind of boredom of repetition to be part of the art, to be strange and interesting and something that people like me can dwell on. So when he makes the same image again and again, even over the period of 10 years, 20 years, that becomes interesting. That becomes something peculiar. So he's always looking for new ways of making art, of thinking about art, of being an artist, most importantly.
So interesting. So luckily we have Claire back, so I'm going to say goodbye. Glad to have you back, Claire.
Thank you so much. Thank you much, Blake. I'm sorry I missed something wonderful, but I
was talking. That's about all I can say, Claire.
7 years. 7 years. There's a lot of writing, a lot of talking that can be done. Blake, how would you like to try it? Should we try with this PowerPoint? I've got it up and ready.
We were talking for a minute about that first image, so let's go to the first image.
It's a wonderful picture, and we'll give Eric a minute. Oh, hang on. Here we go.
A minute ago.
I am going to share my screen, And here we go. We'll do that. And then it will be primed for Eric to bring it on. Ta-da!
There we are.
Woo-hoo!
Technology does occasionally work.
Yes. So this is this wonderful, wonderful photo in the DIA collection by Michelle Andonian, who many of you may know as a absolutely fabulous photographer and a Detroiter. And this is from 1985 when Warhol was promoting his book called America, and he came on a book tour. So with a view from the Pontchartrain Hotel towards the GM Center.
Now, I talked a little bit, Claire, about Warhol's origins in Pittsburgh and the way that must have made Detroit feel a little bit familiar to him, you know, a working class city, which by 85, of course, both cities were on hard times already.
Exactly.
But I wanted to mention the text that's beside this. It's a quote from Warhol's diaries. And there are a couple of things that interest me about it. One is it gives a sense of the madness of trying to write a Warhol biography, because there we have where he was on November 1st, 1985. And I bet I can tell where he was on, you know, every other day through his life, not only because of the diaries, but because of this insane collection of receipts that he kept, of invoices he sent out. So there's this sense with Warhol, I think more than with most figures a biographer might touch on, of knowing him so intimately, knowing so many details of his life that I have to admit I got buried in them. I hope that I didn't bury my readers in them. I could have written a 5,000-page book very easily. But the interesting thing is that Warhol set it up so we'd be in this situation, set it up so we'd have all this information. And that was one of the interesting things about writing about him, is that his presence seemed to be there for me. The very fact that he kept these diaries, and I think always knew we'd see these diaries, meant that he has been very present in the reception of his own work, which is unusual for an artist and complicated.
I think that brings up a wonderful point. And I'm going to see if I can move to another slide on this. And we can talk a little bit about his self-presentation. You talk quite a bit in the book about his self-presentation, and that ties very much into the way he documented himself. But even before he started obsessively documenting himself from the 60s onwards, he's already presenting himself. He's choosing a persona. And I'm putting up on the screen, many of our audience may know this double portrait, these two portraits by Andy Warhol. And here we have, it's from 1967. So here we have a self-presentation of him. Perhaps you can talk about that more generally, and then we can talk about this one specifically.
Yeah, of course, the funny thing about this act of self-presentation is that it's also anti-presentation, right? He's shushing himself in a sense. He's portraying himself as someone with nothing to say. That became, that early on, surprisingly early, I found a reference in a newspaper to that being Warhol's signature gesture. The finger over the mouth, which in person, of course, literally prevents him from talking. So he presents himself as someone who has nothing to say. And he does that throughout the entire 1960s. That switches later. And I think it's important to realize that what happens in his art, we think of him as a great maker of objects, and the early objects, the Campbell soup cans, the Marilyns, we'll be looking, I think, at some of the so-called death and disaster pictures, are amazing freestanding objects. Art historically speaking, there's a lot to get out of them. They're really complicated in terms of the content that they present. But I think in an image like this, it comes at the very end of his career as a painter, because he gives up painting. He gives up traditional object making. And a picture like this is a kind of placeholder for him. It's very hard to say anything really interesting about it as an object. It's a signature example of Warhol's style, but it doesn't have any of the complexity of the soup cans or the Marilyns, for instance. But it is absolutely about him. And you have to read, in a sense, through it and see it as a prop. A lot of Warhol's objects, I think, a lot of Warhol's artworks are props in this larger, what Joseph Beuys called a social sculpture, are props in the way he presented himself in the world, in who he was in the world on a day-to-day basis. I mean, this is a 1967 image, but it's actually originally made in 1966. So he starts repeating himself. He stops making new works of art. He turns repetition into part of what he does. And it's actually, in a funny sense, it rhymes with this image where he's kind of dumb, right? Has nothing to say. Well, repetition is a kind of having nothing to say. So I think this image encapsulates who he turns himself into in the mid-60s once he stops being, deliberately stops being Andy Warhol, the traditional great artist.
That brings up so many different threads that I was going to pull out and talk about. You talk about it as the non-gesture, something that's nothing to say. And this is a man who's already had a PR representative since the early 60s, since what, 63, 64? You mentioned it. So he's very busy not saying what he's not saying.
Yes.
And you also talk about this larger culture in the 60s of the idea of what you call the put-on, or this term, the put-on, that was part of a larger way of denying content, or not just comedians, but other artists and musicians would not talk. So how does that relate here to this gesture, do you think? Or can you talk a little bit about this idea of the put-on that several of our readers among the docents were picked up on that question?
Yeah, I mean, it's one of the most interesting things, maybe almost the single most interesting thing that I discovered about Warhol was that despite him being a giant of culture, he was deeply, deeply involved in culture, in the culture of every moment he lived in. And because he's such a giant, we imagine that he's one of that some of these things are his signature or only belong to him. But for instance, the whole notion of the sort of goofy, strange, naive was very much part of what the Beatles were presenting when they did interviews. There's the famous case, I think it's George, someone asks him, "What do you call your haircut?" And he just says, "Arthur," right? They're always joking like that. They're always poking fun at their interviewers. Bob Dylan's famous for doing this as well. So Warhol was part of that cultural phenomena, the put-on of the 1960s. And that's true at almost every moment in his life. Even in the 1950s, when he's a commercial artist, he's very much plugged into what he needed to be to succeed as a commercial artist. And then in 1961, 62, when he decides to become a certain kind of fine artist, when he realizes he wants to be a great fine artist, he realizes just what he has to do at that particular moment. So it's that sense of being plugged in. In French, they say branché. The idea of being plugged into the culture is so important. And it's important in my book. I tried to set him in his cultural moments because unlike other artists, he's not a kind of isolated creator, that the myth or cliche of the isolated creator. He's very much part of the culture, and being part of the culture is one of the sources of his excellence, I think.
That, I think, is one of the incredible strengths of your book, is really that way in which you embed him. And you embed him first in his childhood culture in Pittsburgh, the Ruthenian community. You embed him in the commercial art world of the 50s, in art school before that. And with each part of his life, you fully embed them. So we don't see him separated out as the great artist, separate from everything. But we see, through your research and words, we see him embedded fully in the culture. And that really, to me, brought a whole new side to Warhol. I'm going to follow up with another. So this one, as I mentioned, is in the Detroit Institute of Arts. I'm going to follow up with another portrait, which is not, but has a fabulous connection to Detroit through one of the very early collectors of Warhol, Florence Barron, who just had such a fabulous eye, and many people in the community may remember Florence Barron very well. And this was one of his very earliest self-portraits, 63, 64, just as another moment in the self-portrait.
Yeah, I'm going to correct you there, Claire, because that is always said about it. But in fact, Warhol had a practice as a self-portraitist dating all the way back to high school. So they're all of these self-portraits. Everyone discounts the art Warhol made before he was a pop artist. But in fact, he had a rich history of art making. He had many, many shows in the 1950s. They flopped, but he did have fine art shows throughout the 50s. And those didn't have self-portraits that I know of in them. But in college, he made a whole bunch of self-portraits as a gay man, quite out gay man. So there's this history. This is his first pop art portrait, though.
Okay, good. Let's stick with that then. Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm just it's such a wonderful thing for Florence Barron to have recognized in '63 and asked him to make. Since he made it, he wanted to make a portrait of her. And she said, well, no, you're the important one. I think her famous quote is something about, I'm just a housewife from Detroit. And of course, much more than that,
Yes,
because she had the vision to go meet Andy and go to the factory and to ask him to make this. So
yes, she was as much of a housewife from Detroit as he was a working class boy from Pittsburgh. She had money, she was collecting, she was brilliant, and of course he was a great artist. So I think she's pulling a Warhol when she says that.
Yeah. So I'm going to keep moving on here, but I wanted to bring that one.
Let's just go back to that for 1 second, because I want to tie it to something else we said. I believe I haven't done any. I thought I knew that Florence Barron was actually part of the Detroit Jewish community. I think that's
correct.
Right.
Yes.
So there again, I talked earlier about some of Warhol's connections to Jewish people, Jewish culture. And here's another example. A lot of his collectors, and as I said, his dealers were Jewish, and she was one of them. The person whose portrait he made at almost the same time as he made this, Ethel Skull, was another important Jewish collector. And I don't think that's accidental. I think that Jewish collectors were interested in the avant-garde because it was, in a sense, outside of the mainstream in a way that they were often forced to be. And I think Warhol spoke to them because he also was outside of the mainstream. So I don't think it's completely accidental. And I think that there'd be something to say, something to write about that connection.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to keep moving on. So Barron visited the factory, and here we have a piece from the DI collection that refers back to the aluminum foil that covered the factory.
Yeah.
This, in fact, is a book with a reference to the Brillo boxes in the back. So tell me a little bit how you would respond to this piece.
Well, the first way I responded to that piece was when I was about 6 or 7 years old. My older brother had a copy, and I very clearly remember breaking it in various ways. It's a book that has a kind of accordion that makes a farting sound inside it. It has all of these funny pop-up elements in it. And I remember quite clearly not deliberately breaking it, but being so keen on playing with his object that I broke many of the elements. And I have it on my bookshelf because my brother has allowed me to keep it.
Good.
I don't know that he knows I've got it actually, but whether he likes it or not, I have it. But much more importantly than that, this is an interesting image because it shows the first objects that were made in Warhol's Silver Factory, this amazing space on 47th Street in New York. And one of the weird things about writing this book is that I moved to New York in 2010, actually early 2011, I think, and moved to 47th Street thinking nothing of it. And it's only when I started my Warhol biography that I realized I was right up the street from his great factory studio. But the interesting thing is this factory is so famous, the Silver Line space where Warhol received his retinue of strange people. But that's not where he made almost all of his pop art. Almost all of his pop art precedes, his most famous pop art, precedes the factory. It was made at home in his brownstone on the Upper East Side of New York, or if for a while he rented a sort of disused and decrepit old firehouse. So he didn't make his pop art for the most part in the factory, but he did make his famous Brillo boxes there. So that stack of Brillo boxes, maybe almost his most famous work of art, would have been made there. And for me, the Brillo boxes are a central key to understanding Andy Warhol because they're about appropriation. They're about taking something from one domain, taking something from the grocery store, from the back room of the grocery store, the box that Brillo pads would have been stored in, and bringing it out and presenting it as art. And that moment of appropriation, of taking something that isn't art, including a young man called Andy Warhol, and presenting that thing, that person as art, is, I think, the single most important key to understanding Warhol's entire achievement. It's based, of course, on what Marcel Duchamp did in 1917 when he took a urinal and said, "This will be art." He simply declared that his powers as an artist allowed him to turn something into art. And that's where Warhol's art really began in the early 1960s. So that's vital to me. That's why I'm so happy that we're showing this image. But it also represents something else because the image that's on top of the Brillo boxes that's superimposed is actually an image from when Andy Warhol was given the prize by the filmmakers co-op in New York for, I can't remember the exact title, Best Filmmaker of the Year, Best Underground Filmmaker of the Year in 1965. So that represents him and his team being filmed literally in his studio. And it's important to know that in 1965, he officially declared that he was no longer going to make art objects. He was just going to be a filmmaker. And that really changes everything in Andy Warhol's life. He makes unbelievably great and unbelievably radical movies instead of making objects. And that's a real linchpin in his entire life that I think people don't quite recognize. They don't realize that he gave up making traditional objects, in theory, entirely in 1965.
And this is where, as somebody who studies still objects and not film, I'm always a little bit out of my depth here. That said, he made Chelsea Girls, he made Sleep, he made the Empire State Building, which you detail with such wonderful descriptions that bring them alive on the page. And yet he also still maintained a parallel career as a painter, even though he reformatted it, he changed it, he tweaked it. How would you balance the two together? Or would you say his heart really stayed with the filmmaking, or was he able to do this bifurcation?
I think his heart, when it came to making things, was with filmmaking, but there was always a parallel stream in his life, which was about making himself, in a sense, being a figure in the culture. Also, frankly, funding the films. A lot of the art he made after 1965, because he continued to turn out what were mostly copies of earlier objects, as when he continued to turn out those self-portraits, those ones with the fingers on his lips. He had to fund his films, but he also turned himself into a business, and that became yet another creation of his. He made that explicit in 1969 or so, when he declared everything he did a component in what he called business art. And he wasn't the only artist to be interested in the notion that being a capitalist, being a businessman, could at least, as a kind of joke, be a form of art as well. A kind of ironic dig at capitalism could come from artists. So Warhol was very involved in that. So sometimes when he was making works, it was literally to make money, and other times it was to have the act of making money count as part of his performance as an artist. It's fiendishly complicated, but I think it's also really interesting.
I love that. And I think it's wonderful that we're discussing this while we still have the original price tag on the screen with $4.95, Andy Warhol.
He would have approved of that, except he would have wished it was worth way more. The book did not sell well, by the way. None of Andy Warhol's books ever sold well until the posthumous diaries. All the other books were dismal failures. So that's important to recognize, is that every time he tried officially to be a good businessman, he failed, which didn't mean he was a failed business artist. It just meant he was a failed businessman.
I'm going to let that absorb. We'll move back in time a little bit, back to some of the pop art produced before that famous switch, or parallel to that famous switch. One of the questions that comes up with Andy Warhol is just how political or just how apolitical he actually was. The Death and Disaster series, but most famously the Jackie images, all using images from Life magazine's photographic story of the assassination of JFK.
Yeah, I mean, these images, in a sense, how could they not be political? I mean, my reading of Warhol in general is that he's much more politically engaged than we think. In fact, I gave a whole talk about that just last week with all new material in it, so anyone who wants to look that up on YouTube can. In fact, when you go through the archives, you actually find physical evidence, documentary evidence for his politics, his left-wing politics, or his liberal politics at least, because there are lots of examples of people thanking him for donations to liberal and left-wing causes. So he's clearly putting his money where his mouth is, or in fact his art where his mouth is, because he's donating works of art a lot of the time. But I mean, a work like this doesn't wear its politics on its sleeve. You can't say what the politics are, but it's clearly involved in the political world of 1960s America. How could it not be? this is the most important, one of the most important political moments in American history. So representing it is inherently political. But what's interesting about it, of course, is that he has a kind of before and after in it. There's Jackie smiling from before the assassination, and then Jackie in mourning afterwards. And the willingness to keep both things in play at the same time, I think, is completely classic Warhol.
Thank you. I'm going to keep moving on here a little bit. We had talking about that. The electric chair, of course, is an image that he returns to over and over again over more than a decade. He keeps coming back to it. But it's not just any electric chair. It is the electric chair from Sing Sing in New York State. So again, this sort of question of politics, which he denied, which he said, no, that it, when you see something gruesome, it doesn't mean anything anymore. If you see it over and over again, it no longer means anything.
Yeah, the weirdest thing about writing a biography of Andy Warhol is that he is the least trustworthy source on his own ideas in his own life. Normally, as a biographer, you trust your subject more than anything else. If your subject says something, it must be true. With Warhol, it's exactly the opposite. So I don't believe that his comments about his own political interests really tell us terribly much. It does tell us that he wants to pretend not to have politics, because that's part of the 1960s put on. It's also, I think, part of a 60s cultural avant-gardism that's suspicious of the easy established emotions of the past, the easy political positions of the past. The notion that when you see an electric chair, you're supposed to have an instant reaction to it. There was a lot of suspicion of any of those kind of established verities in the 60s. And I think that's very important to understanding Warhol, is that, I mean, I even think that when this is something that he's often criticized for, and I've sort of been criticized for it too, for not calling him out, but when he doesn't visit his mother just before she dies, and when he doesn't go to her funeral in 1972, I think that's typical of a certain kind of 60s avant-gardism, a rejection of those, what they would have said were empty pseudo feelings that were entrenched in the culture. So I think having an obvious reaction to the electric chair is the same, but it's important to recognize that this chair is the chair that killed the Rosenbergs, that was used to execute the Rosenbergs, and they were very controversial figures in the 1960s. And it's also, I think, the last chair ever to execute anyone in New York State, because executions are ended in New York State. State executions are ended soon thereafter, and they were much in debate at just the moment that he's doing this image. But one of the other things I want to mention about is this is a 1971 image of the electric chair. So unlike other artists who I think return to the same thing same theme over and over again to say something new, I think what happens with Warhol is when he repeats things, it's not really to say something new, it's to take that object and use it in a new way. And in this case, I think he's using it as business art. Or he's maybe even seeing if the object can be emptied of meaning. An object as powerful as the electric chair can be emptied of meaning if he reproduces it sufficiently often.
Thank you. And just for everybody out here, I'm showing one of a set of 10. So when you see all 10 together, you really get that multiplicity. And we're going to move on to one more where the idea of repeating it over and over again, the idea of multiplicity in Warhol's work, the famous Mao series.
Again, is this political? Is this a condemnation of Mao? Is he mocking Mao by putting lipstick and makeup on him? Mao was, of course, a vitally important figure, a monster in some ways, but also a hero to many people in the early 1970s. And Warhol seems to be allowing that meaning to hover in the air without it ever landing, in a sense. But one of the things I think that's interesting about this series is that it's clearly about reproduction and multiplicity, right? It's a set of 10 screen prints. There were 250 portfolios generated of these screen prints. But even though it's about identical repetition, because every one of these portfolios was perfectly printed and identically printed, Warhol throws in this gesture of the scribble on the side, which is a kind of reference to the traditional notion of the artist's hand, of the artist's skill, of the artist putting their touch onto the surface. But it's the most meaningless scribble you could have, in a sense. It changes from image to image. It doesn't convey information. It's just they're representing the artist's hand without really being an example of it. And he was always, I think this is really important, playing with the notion of authenticity, playing with the notion of authorship, always saying, frankly, to anyone who wanted to buy a Warhol as a unique object by his hand, that they were being kind of dumb. He's always, I think, poking fun at the people who are buying the work that's funding what became a lavish lifestyle. He's always that kind of trickster figure. And I think it's there even in these Maos, especially in that handmade gesture on the side of each one.
Wonderful. I'm going to add one piece that is not by Warhol, just to talk about the lifestyle, to talk about the collecting, and also about how he is perceived and the role model that he becomes for the next generations of artists. This is a wonderful painting that the DIA recently acquired by a contemporary artist, Anand Bass, who has a studio both here in Detroit and another one in Miami. And it's an imagined scene of what it took to catalog Andy's estate when Sotheby's auctioned off 2,500 pieces after his death. So it's an imagined scene where Anand Bass imagines a young Sotheby's intern sitting in the townhouse surrounded by this incredible collection and cataloging it. It's an evocative homage in a way.
Yeah, I love this image. I could talk for 45 minutes about almost every object in this image. I mean, who'd have thought that Warhol owned, or actually I would have thought it because I've seen the receipts, a Joseph Albers, such as on the back wall. You know, the most rigorous of modernist artists, as un-Warhol-like as possible. But Warhol actually is on record liking the work of Joseph Albers. You know, they're the textiles, the Native American textiles, which he raved about, saying they were the greatest works of art by anyone, and especially because they were by women. He had a real interest in art by women. I could go on and on. Of course, there's a Picasso in the background there, Warhol's greatest competitor, if you like, his greatest rival, I should say. Sorry. But one thing that matters to me, I think I understand that Hernan Bass is actually a gay artist, and I think that that's partly what this is about. One could imagine that the skinny little figure in the middle there might be a gay employee of Sotheby's. And he's got one hand on Warhol's wig as a kind of an icon, a relic of this vitally important queer figure. And I think that that's something I really tried to dwell on a lot in my book, is how important Warhol's homosexuality, more importantly, his queerness, his cultural, the way he portrayed himself culturally as a homosexual is really vital to understanding who he was. And I think that really he was important as a role model, as I understand it, for a lot of queer artists who came at the same time as him. He was more willing to explore his queer identity than certainly any other artist, or virtually any artist in the 1950s when he began exploring that. But he's always there as some kind of a queer model, a queer icon, right through the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I think that can't be underplayed, I think, in understanding who he was.
Wonderful. And I encourage people, I don't remember whether this is on display right now. We're reinstalling the contemporary art. But if it's not on now, it will be very soon. I do encourage people to come and experience this absolutely wonderful contemporary painting. I am going to forward one more, and we just, and then we'll move on to some more questions here. Blake, you have a fabulous website called Warholiana, and I am going to look at, see what questions people have talking here. We've got a whole bunch, but if we run out of time, we have about 9 minutes now. If we run out of time, you can email Blake. Do include an email address so he can reply. And he even mentioned that you can ask for a signed book plate if you give him your name and address. So there are various ways to reach him.
That's right. I'm available and happy to always talk about Warhol. This website is where I post some of the stranger finds that may not be in the book, usually aren't in the book. So there's all sorts of curiosities about Warhol that I've discovered since writing the book, or especially that were too minor to include even in the endnotes to the book. There are, by the way, 7,500 endnotes, if anyone's a glutton for punishment, that are available on the HarperCollins website. They were far too big to include in the printed book, so they're there for anyone who wants them. And they're corrected there as well. There are also corrections on this Warholiana website. So if anyone spots an error in my book, please let me know and I'll add them to my corrections on the website.
Great. Now I have a few, I mean, we've got some wonderful questions here from our audience. And one actually is asking, could you talk a little bit about his relationships with other artists? For example, with Basquiat, for example.
Yeah, I mean, he knew so many artists. He was much more involved in the art world than I think people realize, because he presented himself as such a kind of idiot savant, as though he wasn't part of the culture, but he really was. Female artists especially, I've written a whole essay on his connection and his debt to female artists. Basquiat's a really interesting case because, of course, Basquiat's much, much younger than Andy Warhol. But in the 1980s, Basquiat represented the cutting edge, and Warhol always wanted to be on the cutting edge. And I think there's some interesting things to talk about and think about when it comes to Warhol's interest in a young Black man trying to make it in the art world the way he was a young gay man in the 1950s. Basquiat's good friend, Fab Five Freddy, talked to me about the ways in which Warhol, as a kind of wacky outsider gay man, spoke to them, because they were a Black avant-garde that also had a hard time finding a place for itself in the mainstream. So there's some really interesting connections there. I could go on forever about Warhol's connections to Jasper Johns and Robert Rauschenberg, who were vitally important influences on Andy Warhol. I think the influences on Warhol have generally been under-recognized. There's some really interesting, to understand Warhol, you really do need to understand where he was coming from, what art world he was coming from. And I try to do that in my book.
Well, and that actually brings up another question we had from one of the docents, which was going back to some of his earlier influences in the 50s, Charles Demuth and Jean Cocteau, and how they became models for his earlier work.
Yeah, I mean, anyone in the gay world in the 1940s or 1950s would have recognized them as specifically gay artists. And when you read the coverage of their shows, in fact, even the catalog to MoMA's, I think it's a 1949 show, the Museum of Modern Art, had a big Demuth retrospective. And there's all sorts of little quiet homophobic digs, or at any rate, outings of him as gay, but they're very, very subtle. And that's exactly the kind of commentary that Warhol got in his shows in the 1950s. I said a few minutes ago that he had fine art shows. He was a practicing fine artist in the 1950s, but there was always just enough queer content in his works, and sometimes a great deal of queer content, to make the reviews always stick the knife in. There was always a kind of quiet homophobia, but in the 1950s, quiet homophobia spoke loudly. Everyone knew how to read the codes for when someone was being attacked. So it was interesting that Warhol is having the same attacks that Demuth and Cocteau were having against them. And I think they were very important, not just for Warhol, but for all of New York's queer community at just that moment, as people who were able to turn out work that was almost explicitly gay and somehow get away with it.
Moving sideways a little bit, we just got a question about the Velvet Underground. Mm-hmm. Can you speak a little bit about his relationship with the group, with the Velvet Underground?
I can speak a little bit. I will say a musical ignoramus, especially when it comes to pop music. So I can only take other people's opinions that they're one of the greatest bands of the 1960s. But in fact, given that when I was a teenager, punk was what mattered, and the fact that the Velvet Underground are really the first punk band ever, I can appreciate how great they really were. But I think they were part of Warhol's effort to be part of an avant-garde. They were an avant-garde that, interestingly, was part of pop culture as well. And it's the collapsing of avant-garde and pop culture that happens with the Velvet Underground that was of special importance to Warhol. And the Warhol had nothing to do with their creativity except to give them the courage to push things further. He always said, don't back down. Don't let the producers let you soften your sound. Do what you think you should do. They all credit him with allowing them, giving them the license to be as great as they were. And of course, literally lending his name to the band as their manager so that they could get exposure, so that they would become known to a larger audience, and in fact make at least some money when they were touring in 66, 67 as Andy Warhol's house band. But I think he recognized genius in them. And that's one of the things he was so good at doing, was recognizing when someone else was doing something really, really exciting. But it's worth mentioning that the Velvet Underground, especially John Cale, were deeply connected to the avant-garde in art music, in so-called classical music at this moment. So Warhol would have understood them in that context as well, and he knew all about that particular avant-garde. What would have excited him, and excited other people too, was that they came out of that avant-garde and entered pop culture much the way he did. He came out of a fine art avant-garde and inserted himself into pop culture.
And boy, did he do that with great success.
Yeah.
I am looking at the clock. We have a couple minutes. Blake, did you have anything you wanted to add at this moment? I can fish out a couple more.
Let's have one more question instead, because I talk too much anyway.
I don't think so. And as I said, we're after 7 years. Let's see. How about just thinking about this tension in pop art? And you just talked about how Warhol came out. He was a fine artist. He was a commercial artist. He was a fine artist, but he became a pop artist. He became part of pop culture more broadly, not just pop art. So can you talk about a little more about this tension between the breadth of pop art, its popularity, its cultural import, and the goals of still being a fine artist in some way? I mean, he managed those in different ways at different times.
That's a perfect question for us to end on, because one of the things I hold to most firmly in my book, one of the most important take-home messages, if you like, in my book, is that Warhol was always a fine artist, always wanted to be a fine artist. From college years and before, from high school years, his ambition was to be the very best fine artist that he could possibly be. I don't think that being a part of pop culture, just for its own sake, was what mattered to him. He didn't want to be, I don't think he even wanted to be the Beatles in a sense. He wanted to be an artist who recognized that the most interesting thing you could do in fine art, circa 1965, was to enter pop culture. So there's a kind of performance of being part of pop culture that's different from really wanting to be part of it. But the weird thing is that performance itself became part of pop culture. And it's that insane feedback loop that makes him, I think, so absolutely fascinating, that even as he's this very highest of high artists, that high art keeps feeding back into the culture. And then he takes what he has become in the pop culture and uses it to supercharge his performance as a fine artist. And that I think is his greatest single achievement, is blending those two things, but always in order to make more important, more interesting avant-garde 20th century art.
Fabulous, fabulous. So I am going to wrap up here. We are at 8 o'clock on the dot. I am going to lift up the book one more time, everybody. You can get
if
it from
nothing else, it's great for workouts, you know.
It is indeed.
Pandemic workout.
And you can get it through the JCC bookstore. And thank you once again so much to the Jewish Book Fair for inviting Blake. It has been so much fun. I have really enjoyed meeting you remotely and having these fabulous conversations. And thank you again.
Claire, thank you so much for putting up with the technological problems and being such a great conversationalist. And thanks to everyone there in Detroit. Read about Warhol, even if it's not my book. Go to the DIA, look at Warhol, read about him, think about him. I think he's worth it.
Well, again, thank you both. After a rocky start, a very strong finish. Thank you both for enlightening us on his fascinating life and his art. And I greatly appreciate all of you at home who have tuned in. Our next Jewish Book Fair event is tomorrow morning at 9:30 a.m. with Cindy Franco, the author of The Plague of the Tender-Hearted. Remember to like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel, and visit our website, culturalarts.jccdet.org/bookfair for our full schedule and ways to get involved. Please stay safe and have a good night.